heart keeps the blood in motion. That's what it's designed to do. If blood stops moving, you're going to stop moving. Okay? Nutrients, oxygen supplies, everything stops after it gets exhausted. The heart beats about 100,000 times every day, about 70 beats per minute. The heart pumps 1.5 million gallons of blood every year. It's a lot of blood. It's about 2.9 gallons per minute. Heart pumps between 5 and 30 liters of blood per minute. There's a big variation. Human body has about 5.6 liters of blood, about 6 quarts. This blood circulates through the body 3 times every minute. So every 3 times every minute, your blood makes a complete cycle through your body. In one day, a drop of blood is going to travel about 12,000 miles. Okay, it's a long distance. That's a long distance to travel. If you took we're talking about all the arteries, veins, and capillaries for the heart system now. So if you took all your arteries, your veins, and your capillaries and laid them end to end, it would stretch about 60,000 miles, which is 2.5 times around the earth. Your body has a lot of blood vessels. Okay, the heart's about the size of your clenched fist. Consists of 4 chambers. You have 2 atria and 2 ventricles. The heart pumps blood in 2 circuits. You have a pulmonary circuit and a systemic circuit. The pulmonary circuit goes to the lungs, from the heart to the lungs, back to the heart. The systemic circuit goes from the heart to the rest of the entire body and back to the heart, bypassing the lungs. Those are your 2 circuits. Okay, so there's your pulmonary circuit. You go from the heart to your lungs and back to the heart. Systemic circuit goes from the heart, pumps through the entire body except for the lungs, and then back to the heart. Goes to the brain, goes to upper, lower limbs, everywhere. Okay. Each circuit has arteries, veins, and capillaries. You got to have those 3 things. Arteries, by definition, transport blood away from the heart. That's an artery. So arteries transport blood away from the heart. Veins transport blood to the heart. Okay? And capillaries are what connects the arteries and veins together. So the arteries transporting blood away, then it goes through the capillaries, the arteries and the veins connect, and comes back through the veins back to the heart. So your capillary is your connecting piece between your artery and your veins. The pericardium, okay, that's the serous membrane that lines the pericardial cavity. Remember, a cavity is like you take a balloon and you put your fist in that balloon and you have 2 layers. That's the sac that surrounds the heart. There's 2 layers. There's a visceral pericardium and there's a parietal pericardium. The visceral pericardium is the touching the organ. The pericardium, the parietal pericardium, is the part that's further away from it, or touching more of the epidermis, the outer layer of the skin, closest to that. Okay, so there's your 2. Just think of the sac as a balloon that you punched a hole in. You punched with your fist and made a crater, and that's your sac. Okay, this visceral pericardium is called your epicardium. The parietal pericardium, okay, is reinforced by a layer of fibrous pericardium. Okay, these constitute the pericardial sac. They help protect the heart to keep it in place. Okay, there's your balloon that you're punching your fist in. And this lining here, I'll use my little white marker here. This lining with the tip of the white line, this area here, this is your parietal pericardium. The tip of the bottom one here, this is your visceral pericardium. That actually, if that fist was the heart, that actually touches the organ. Okay, you can see it right here in the picture here. This is your parietal pericardium. You can see the lines pointing to the outside edge of the sac. And this is your visceral pericardium. This is the inside edge that's closest to the heart. So the visceral is closer to the organ, the heart in this case. The parietal is closest to the epidermis. The walls of the heart consist of 3 layers. There's an epicardium, myocardium, and endocardium. Epicardium is the external surface. Myocardium is the cardiac muscle cells. And the endocardium is the internal surface. So these cardiac muscle cells, they're mostly dependent on aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration is the efficient form where 1 glucose produces 32 to 34, 34 to 36 ATP molecules. Anaerobic respiration produces 2 to 3. Okay, it's not as near as efficient. Our heart has to be efficient. So our heart depends on oxygen. If the body's deprived of oxygen, the heart's going to stop. Okay, it's not going to run anaerobic respiration. It runs on aerobic respiration. The circulatory supply of cardiac muscle tissue is very extensive. We'll learn some of the major arteries and the veins surrounding the heart to get blood to the heart. Because you remember, the blood has to have oxygen supply also. It's part of the organs that needs to keep going. Cardiac muscles contract without information coming from the central nervous system. In other words, the heart muscles do not need a signal from the central nervous system to contract. They contract independently of the central nervous system. Okay? You can be in a coma. We have very little brain function. Does not have to send information for the heart to beat. Cardiac muscle cells are interconnected by intercalated disc. Remember, that's how we defined our muscles. We have 3 types of muscles. We have skeletal muscle, we have cardiac muscle, and we have smooth muscle. Okay, smooth muscle is just a mass, no striations. Skeletal and cardiac have striations, but cardiac muscles have intercalated discs. Intercalated discs allow that electronic signal to transfer within the entire heart through all the cells, connect them all, so that all the muscles contract simultaneously. So whenever we see a histological slide of a cardiac muscle, you're going to see intercalated discs. And that's what intercalated discs look like, those lines right here. These are your intercalated discs, these lines. And that's just a junction so that when the cells contact each other, when it contracts, the signal is sent, it's sent to all the cells at one time. And you get a simultaneous contraction. Because, I mean, think about it. If the heart contract, if the parts of the heart contract at different times, the blood's not going to go anywhere. You have to have a mass contraction of everything at once to force that blood through the entire body. Okay.
Actually,
so the intercalated disc, those are specialized cell-to-cell junctions. The sarcolemma, those are the plasma membrane, the outer membrane of the muscle cell. The sarcolemma, the 2 cardiac cells, are bound together by desmosomes. We had desmosomes and hemidesmosomes, gap junctions, tight junctions, things like that. They would hold our cells together. Okay, so it's held together by desmosomes. The intercalated disc bind the myofibrils of adjacent cells together. So your contracting muscles are bound together. Cardiac muscles are bound together by gap junctions, so information can pass easily from one cardiac cell to another. So ions move directly from one cell to another, allowing all the muscle cells to contract as a single unit. That's the importance of these intercalated discs. Okay. And you can see how they're this is right here. You can see the intercalated disc right here at the end of each one, and that's how they join together. The intercalated disc, the mitochondria you can see, the nucleus you can see inside the cells. And it contracts just like the actin and myosin bridges, just like they did in the skeletal muscles. So the fibrous skeleton, each cardiac cell is wrapped in an elastic sheath. Each muscle cell is wrapped in a fibrous sheath. The fibrous sheaths separate the superficial layer from the deep layer muscles. So these fibrous sheaths encircle the base of the pulmonary trunk and the ascending aorta. That's where the blood gets pumped out of the heart. The blood leaves the heart at 2 places. It leaves it through the pulmonary trunk to go to the lungs, and it leads through the ascending aorta where it goes to the rest of the body. Those are the only 2 places the blood leaves the heart. Okay? And that's where these fibrous sheaths encircle it, because that's the place where you're going to have the most pressure. Right when the blood is leaving the heart, that's the highest pressure. It has to be. That's where your pump is pushing it. That's where all the force is going to be to get that blood to go through your entire body or to your lungs. So those 2 places, the pulmonary trunk and the ascending aorta, are your 2 exit points of the heart where blood's going to the lungs or the rest of the body. Okay, and they're surrounded by fibrous sheath to help protect that area. So it stabilizes these fibrous sheaths, stabilize the position of the cardiac cells, keep them in place. They stabilize the position of the heart valves. We have valves. We have valves in our heart. We'll talk about each. We have 4 different valves. We'll talk about each of those. Provide support for blood vessels and nerves in the myocardium, the muscle cells of the heart, and it helps to distribute the force of contraction. So as the heart contracts, you want this mass of blood to be directed to one of those outlets in an efficient, direct way. Okay, so it helps distribute that force, so it's efficient. It prevents the overexpansion of the heart. Okay, when the heart contracts, those muscles relax and expand back up again. This helps prevent it, and the fibrous sheath around it helps the heart from expanding too much as it rebounds and comes back from its contraction. It provides elasticity, so the heart can recoil after contraction. Again, once you contract, that heart has to go back to normal. It has to relax and fill back up. And this elasticity allows it to retain its original shape after the contractions relax. It isolates your atrial cells from the ventricular cells. Your atrium and your ventricle have to pump into each other, and they have to be separate chambers. If there's a leak between there, then you have a murmur, and you can have some heart damage. Okay, anatomically, the heart lies slightly to the left of the midline. Okay, it's located in the mediastinum. The mediastinum is the portion of your body between the apex of your lungs. Your lungs come up in the center of your body and have two peaks up here. Between these two peaks, that's called the mediastinum. That's where your heart's located. Okay? The apex is the inferior portion of the heart. If you draw a heart, you draw your two lumps and you draw like you're drawing for a Valentine. You draw your two lumps and you draw your point. That point is the apex. That's the inferior portion of the heart. The heart sits in an oblique angle. It is not lying straight up and down. It lies in an angle to the left side. Okay? The right border is formed by the right atrium. The inferior border is formed by the right ventricle. So the atrium's superior, the ventricle is inferior on both the right and the left when we're looking at the heart. But your heart is rotated slightly towards the left. So the heart appears to be twisted just a bit. The sternocostal surface, but when you have your sternum and your clavicle, sternocostal surface is formed by the right atrium and right ventricle. So the heart's laying on its side just a little bit. The posterior surface is formed by the left atrium. And that's how the heart lies in the body. You can see it right in here. You can start under the sternum. Okay. You can see how it lines up in the mediastinum and has a slight angle towards the left of the body. Okay. And you can see as it forms this wall, this is the right atrium, right ventricle. The left of them to the other side, but you can't see it from here. All right. 4 chambers of the heart can identify sulci. Sulci are grooves on the external surface. You have an interatrial groove, which separates the left and right atrium. You have a coronary sulcus, separates the atrium and the ventricles. You have an anterior interventricular sulcus, which separates the left and right ventricles. And you have a posterior interventricular sulcus that is the same thing, but on the backside of the heart, separates the left and right ventricles. Okay. So here's your coronary sulcus, and there's fat in it on the picture here. This is the coronary sulcus in the middle. It separates the atrium from the ventricles. Okay, there's your right atrium, right ventricle. Here's your left ventricle. Your left atrium is up on the top here. Okay, so left and right atria, positioned superior to the coronary sulcus. Remember, the coronary sulcus separates the atrium from the ventricles. So the atrium are superior to the coronary sulcus. The ventricles are inferior to the coronary sulcus. The left and right atrium both have thin walls because the atrium are only pumping blood into the ventricles. The ventricles are doing most of the work to go to the lungs or the heart, rest of the body. So your atrium are thin walls and expandable extensions called auricles that cover over the top of them. Okay, your ventricles are going to have your thick walls. Okay, so that's the left and right atria. The left and right ventricles are positioned inferior to the coronary surface, and much of the left ventricles forms a diaphragmatic surface. When the heart lies on its side, it pushes against the diaphragm, and that forms most of the surface of it. That's where it touches. Okay. Again, the same picture again. You can see the coronary sulcus. Coronary sulcus, inferior to the coronary sulcus is your ventricle. Superior to your coronary sulcus is your atrium. If you look at a frontal section of the heart, you have the left and right atrium that are separated by the interatrial septum. You have left and right ventricles that are separated by the interventricular septum. Okay, the atrioventricular valves are formed from folds of the endocardium. That's what forms the valves inside the heart. You know, the valves are going to separate or isolate the atriums from the ventricles. Okay, the atrioventricular valves are situated between the atrium and the ventricles. Atrial ventricular valves. And there's two of them, one for the right, one for the left. Okay. So here's your atrium. This is your right atrium right here. This is your right ventricle. This is your left atrium. This is your left ventricle. Between the right atrium and right ventricle is an AV valve, atrioventricular valve. You can see the white valve right there. This is a tricuspid valve on the right side. There's 3 cusps to it. On the left side, there's another, oops, come back. Okay. On the left side, there's another valve. Okay. This is a bicuspid valve. Okay. It separates the atrium from the ventricle. And this was also called the mitral valve. You ever hear mitral valve prolapse? You have a patient mitral valve prolapse. That means the valve leaks on the left side. This is where you have endocarditis can affect it, things like that, other diseases, if you have problems with that valve. Okay, so you have the heart, 4 chambers. The right side, the AV valve is tricuspid, 3 cusps. On the left side, okay, the AV valve is 2 cusps. It's called your mitral valve. So far, so good. Okay, and on the picture here, you can see your interatrial septum. This is the muscle here between the right and left atrium. It's kind of hard to see there, but you can see right here, this is the interventricular septum. This muscle mass separates the right side of the ventricle from the right ventricle from the left ventricle. Okay, and you see how thick this muscle is around the left ventricle? That's because the left ventricle is pumping blood all the way through the body. So it's going to have your thickest muscle mass. Oh, you can put it in the kitchen.
Put it in the kitchen?
Yeah, put the kitchen.
Okay, cool.
All right. Thanks, Lizzie.
Yeah.
All right. So you have the right atrium. Yeah, there's 4 chambers you got to think about. The right atrium receives deoxygenated blood through 3 veins. Okay, so 3 veins enter the right atrium. We'll start at the right atrium. So deoxygenated blood means the body has already used the oxygen up, and now it's returning to the heart to get more. So it's gone through the body, oxygen is diffused to the interstitial tissues, delivered to its cells. Now that blood's coming back. Okay, and it goes in the right atrium. There's 3 entrance points in the right atrium. There's the inferior vena cava, there's a superior vena cava, and there's a coronary sinus. Those are your 3 entry points into the heart. Okay, so the right atrium receives deoxygenated blood from the superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus. The inferior vena cava comes in from below atrium, superior vena cava from the top, and the coronary sinus enters from the posterior side, the back side of the heart. Okay, the right atrium contains what's called pectinate muscles. Okay, these are parallel ridges in the walls of the atrium of the heart, and they increase the power of the contractions, and they don't really increase the mass of the heart. Okay, those are called your pectinate muscles. Those only occur in the atrium. It also contains what's called the fossa ovalis. That's the remnant of what's the foramen ovale. The foramen ovale is an opening in the heart between the right atrium and the left atrium. Okay, it allows blood to flow directly across there. What this does, you think about it, it bypasses the lungs. So when the baby's developing, the fetus is developing, in the mother, are the lungs being used? No, they're not, right? The mother is supplying air, oxygen for the infant. So the blood comes into the baby's heart. And why go to the right ventricle and pump the lungs and come back again? It doesn't do that. It goes from the right atrium and shunts across to the left atrium. Left ventricle pumps the rest of the baby's body and then goes back out. So you're bypassing the lungs. You're taking them out of the circulation. Okay. Ever hear of a blue baby that's born in a hospital, emergency room? Blue babies where that opening doesn't close. So the lung, once the baby's born, that valve, that opening slams shut, and now the baby starts to breathe, take their own first breath. If that opening, the fossa ovalis, doesn't shut, that blood continues to pump and bypass the lungs. And that's going to give the baby the blue color. Okay, a hole in the heart. That's also what's referred to as. And there's surgeries to correct these. So that's the fossa ovalis. Okay, and it's the foramen ovale. Okay, which is the opening. That's the actual foramen. The fossa ovalis is what's left over is a sealed area in the heart wall. And it basically allows blood to shunt and prevent the lungs from being used because the baby doesn't need the lungs to be used. Okay, so here we'll look at You look at your superior vena cava, enters the top part of the right atrium. Again, veins are in blue, arteries are in red. Okay, so here's your superior vena cava. Here's your inferior vena cava, this blue tube on the bottom. So the superior vena cava enters the superior part of the right atrium. The inferior vena cava enters the inferior part of the right atrium. And the coronary sinus is that opening right back there in the back. So it's opening the coronary sinus, feeds into the back right in the middle of the atrium. Okay, and you see the fossa ovalis is cover your foramen ovale, which is your remnant of your tissue right there. These little ridges in the wall, your pectinate muscles. Again, only found in the right atrium. Okay, and that covers all that. All right, perfect. Okay, so the right atrium gets all the blood and it pumps blood into the right ventricle through the right AV valve, which is a tricuspid valve. Okay, and valves just shut and isolate the atrium from the ventricles. So when the atrium fills with blood, the blood doesn't flow in the ventricle. It fills up, valve opens, atrium contracts, squirts blood to the ventricle, the valve closes again. So the blood stays in the ventricle. So the right ventricle receives deoxygenated blood from the right atrium. Again, there's no ability to get oxygen yet. The blood enters the ventricle by passing through the tricuspid valve, the right AV valve. Blood then leaves the ventricle through the pulmonary valve. So when the ventricle contracts, now it pushes into the pulmonary trunk. Okay, there's a pulmonary valve there that opens and it feeds in the pulmonary trunk. That's one of the two ways out of the heart. Remember, the pulmonary trunk and the aorta are the only two ways out of the heart. The pulmonary trunk comes out from the right ventricle. The aorta comes out from the left ventricle. There's only two possibilities. Okay, the pulmonary trunk, once it enters that, branches to the right and left pulmonary arteries. One goes to the right lung, one goes to the left lung. Okay, so the right AV valve that separates the atrium and the ventricle is connected to papillary muscles called things called chordae tendineae. Chordae tendineae are these little strings that hold in the valve, and they connect into what's called your papillary muscles. And those hold the valve. They prevent the valve from closing too far. In other words, here's your valve and it's sealed. The valve opens and blood flows. As the valve starts to close again, these chordae tendineae pull on it from the papillary muscles and prevent it from going like this and opening back into the atrium. Okay, so they keep it closed. They keep it from inverting. Okay, there's three cusps to the valve. So the chordae tendineae are connected to three papillary muscles. Papillary muscles and chordae tendineae prevent valve inversion going back up when the ventricle contracts. If they don't function right, that's when you get heart murmurs and you get different aspects of diseases. Okay? So the right ventricle, okay, the right ventricle is contracting and pumping blood into the pulmonary trunk, which is going to the pulmonary arteries, going to the right and left lungs. The internal surface of your right ventricle consists of trabeculae carneae. Okay, these are iridomassive columns of right and left ventricles that help produce a powerful pumping motion. You have this in both the right and left ventricles, trabeculae carneae. They're irregular shaped muscle groups or columns that allow powerful contractions when that heart muscle contracts. Okay. The moderator band. The moderator band you will see on most NCLEX tests for your nursing exams. The moderator band is a weird little structure. It is only found in the right ventricle. It's a little band of muscle that's only found on the wall of the right ventricle. Okay, it's a muscular band. It goes from the interventricular septum to the ventricular wall, and it prevents the overexpansion of the thin-walled right ventricle. In other words, the right ventricle is not as thick as the left ventricle. So to help prevent that from overexpanding after it's filling back up, we have in there what's called the moderator band. The left ventricle doesn't need one because it's got such a mass of thick muscle tissue for its pumping action. Okay, so your moderator band is only found in the right ventricle. Left atrium, we talked about left atrium, right atrium, right ventricle. Goes into the pulmonary trunk, goes to the lungs, goes back into the heart, into the left atrium. So the left atrium receives oxygenated blood. Okay, remember the right atrium and the right ventricle receive deoxygenated blood. This receives oxygenated blood because it came back from the lungs. CO2 went out of the blood, oxygen came into the blood, now it goes back to the heart. So the left atrium receives oxygenated blood, okay? And it comes back to the heart through the left and right, pulmonary veins. Remember, arteries go away from the heart, veins go to the heart. Does not necessarily mean they're carrying oxygenated blood or deoxygenated blood. There are no pectinate muscles on the left atrium. There's only pectinate muscles on the right atrium. Blood then passes through the atrioventricular valve, and the atrioventricular valve on the left side is a bicuspid valve. That's also known as your mitral valve. Okay, so that's your left atrioventricular valve is a bicuspid valve. Okay, it's associated with mitral valve prolapse, which is where the valve doesn't seal all the way and blood leaks out of the ventricle back up into the atrium, and it gives a murmur. This can cause a problem called endocarditis. If a person has a non-functional mitral valve prolapse, when they come to a dental office, okay, we give them antibiotics before we clean their teeth or before we do any dental work on that's going to produce blood or produce any type of bacteria or pathogens into the blood. For the simple reason, if we introduce bacteria into the bloodstream, which when you clean teeth, you bleed, when you floss, you bleed your teeth, the gums bleed, okay? That bacteria gets in the bloodstream, it travels to the heart, okay? If it gets into the left ventricle, there's a chance that that blood can back up and get caught above the mitral valve and not go through the valve completely. And that bacteria can lodge on the heart because the blood is backing up there, okay? That's what you have to do, this prolapse. You're having this murmur where it's causing the blood to back up. That's what the murmur sounds like. So it causes the bacteria to stick or adhere to the heart at that mitral valve. And if you got bacteria infection on the heart, that can be fatal. And that's what's called endocarditis. Okay? It's one of the problems of the mitral valve prolapse. Okay? Most functional murmurs, we don't worry about anymore. But with mitral valve prolapse, you have to be concerned with endocarditis occurring with that. Okay? So again, here was the heart. This is the path. Let me use a green marker here. This is the right ventricle going into the pulmonary trunk. Pulmonary trunk goes into the right and left pulmonary arteries. And this goes to the lung. It comes back from the lung through the left and right pulmonary veins. Okay. Now this is oxygenated blood. That's why it's red. Okay. Most of the time your arteries are red and your veins are blue. Okay. Because red means it's oxygenated. Blue means it lacks oxygen, is deoxygenated. Okay. But the left and right pulmonary veins carry oxygenated blood because they come from the lungs. And it dumps it into the left atrium. Left atrium passes through the mitral valve, which is the atrioventricular valve on the left side, which is bicuspid valve, into the left ventricle. So the left atrium and the left ventricle contain oxygenated blood. The right ventricle and the right atrium contain deoxygenated blood. So far, so good. Don't hear any complaining, so I guess we're good. Okay, now we're in the left ventricle. Okay, the left ventricle has the thickest wall. It's huge. You remember the left, because it has to pump out of the heart. The right ventricle has to pump to the lungs. I mean, the heart and the lungs are fairly close to each other. So you don't need that much force to pump it. Okay, now the left ventricle, it's got to send that blood through the entire body. It has to have a huge muscle. That wall is extremely thick. So you need to contract and pump the blood through the entire systemic circuit. Remember, the pulmonary circuit is very small. Systemic circuit goes to the entire body. So it's got to push enough force to drive that drop of blood from your heart all to the top of your brain or all the way down to the bottom of your foot. Okay, so compared to the right ventricle, it's a thin wall since it only pumps through the pulmonary circuit. Remember, you have the two circuits. Understand the difference between them. The left ventricle does not have a moderator band. Remember, the moderator band is only found in the right ventricle. I guarantee you'll see that on your nursing exams. Okay, that's the only place it's found, and it's to prevent the ventricle from expanding too much when it recoils because the muscles aren't that thick. The left ventricle, it's a mass of muscles. There's no way you're going to overextend that thing. The muscle is so thick. It doesn't need a moderator band. Now, the AV valve between the left atrium and left ventricle also has chordae tendineae connecting the two cusps to two papillary muscles. Okay, so on the right side, you have three papillary muscles because it is a tricuspid valve, your AV valve. On the left side, you have two papillary muscles because the mitral valve or the AV valve on the left side only has two cusps. Okay, so two papillary muscles, and then that connects with chordae tendineae, those little strings also. Okay. Blood leaves the left ventricle by passing through the aortic valve and entering into the aorta. Remember, blood can only leave the heart two ways, the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. It goes through the pulmonary valve from the right ventricle into the pulmonary trunk. It goes through the aortic valve into the aorta from the left ventricle. It's the only two ways blood leaves the heart. So blood enters your ascending aorta. The aorta has several different areas. If this is your heart, I'll draw a perfect heart here, just like that. There's your heart. Okay, here's your left ventricle as it comes up here. It comes out the aorta. This is the ascending aorta. Then this aorta arches. This is your aortic arch. Then the aorta starts to go down. This is your descending aorta. So you've got ascending aorta, the aortic arch, and your descending aorta. Descending aorta. Okay. So far, so good. All right. So this is where we at. This is your left ventricle here. This is the thick, huge muscle mass. This is the ventricle. Here, blood's being pumped. This is going through it goes underneath here and through here. It goes through the aortic valve into the ascending aorta. The aorta has a branch or an arch here, and it comes around and it starts to come down and it comes back down. You pick it up back down here again, and this is your descending aorta. So you have an ascending aorta, aortic arch, descending aorta. You can see on the left ventricle here, this is your chordae tendineae, and you have two papillary muscles. On the right side, you have the chordae tendineae and three papillary muscles because of different valves. And that's all I want on that one. Perfect. So structural differences we talked about between the left and right ventricles. The right ventricle has thinner walls because it's pumping less distance, weaker contractions, and has a moderator band to prevent overexpansion. The left ventricle has extremely thick wall muscle, very, very powerful contraction, 6 to 7 times more powerful than the right ventricle. It has to travel 6 to 7 times farther than the blood being pumped by the right ventricle. Okay, making sense?
Yes.
This is what you would see if we do a dissection of it. You can see all the different things. This is your aortic arch right here. Okay, you got 3 main arteries that branch off right off the aortic arch. We'll review those as we come up here. But this is a brachiocephalic trunk, the left common carotid artery, and the left subclavian artery. Okay, those are the first 3 arteries that branch off the aorta. You can see the superior vena cava. Remember, the superior vena cava brings everything from the superior surface down to the heart. The inferior vena cava you can't see on here, but that brings everything from underneath up to the heart. And the carotid sinus brings everything from the heart back into the back of it. This is the right atrium. This is your right ventricle here. Look at the difference in muscle mass. This is the thickness of the wall of the right ventricle. This is the thickness of the wall of the left ventricle. Everybody should see the difference easily. It's huge. Easy way to discern the right ventricle from the left ventricle. Okay. This is the cusp of your AV valve right here. This is a tricuspid valve. You can see the chordae tendineae coming in and attaching to your papillary muscle. And again, on the right side, there's 3 papillary muscles. It's a tricuspid valve. On the left side, it's a bicuspid valve. There's 2 papillary muscles. And you can see the papillary muscle real well on this one. It's right here. So the muscle extending right there. That's your papillary muscle. And you can see the strings attached to it. This is your chordae tendineae that attach to the valve. And the chordae tendineae prevent the inversion of the atrioventricular valve. They stretch, they stop at a point where the valve's closed, and they don't let it go any further and open back up. You can see your interventricular septum. This is the division between the left and right ventricle. And this is the left atrium right up in here. And this is your pulmonary trunk. This is where the right ventricle contracts and blood exits through here up into the pulmonary trunk, into the left and right pulmonary arteries. Okay. And again, trabecular carinae are present on the right and left ventricles. Okay. It's just a muscle pattern, basically. That's like interwoven, like a braid, and allows for contractions to occur very forcefully because they're running at different angles. So it allows everything to maximum force of contraction for the heart, for the muscle. All right, structure and function of heart valves. Okay, there's 4 valves in the heart. There's 2 AV valves, one between the right atrium, right ventricle, one between the left atrium and the left ventricle. And there's 2 semilunar valves, which is your aortic valve, which goes from the left ventricle into the aorta. And there's a pulmonary valve, which goes from the right ventricle into the pulmonary trunk. So you have 4 valves of the heart. You need to know all 4 of those. Okay. Each AV valve, atrioventricular valve, has 4 parts. Has a ring of connective tissue that connects to the heart tissue to keep it intact and keep it sealed. It has cusps. The right side has 3 cusps. The left side has 2 cusps. It has chordae tendineae that connect the cusp to papillary muscles to prevent inversion of the valve. And it has papillary muscles, which connect to the chordae tendineae to anchor them. Those are your AV valves. And here's a picture of your AV valves. This is your AV valve here. This is 1. I can't see it. Let's go back to red. This is 1. This is 2. This is 3 cusps. This is 1 cusp. This is 2 cusps. Those are your AV valves, atrioventricular valves. Okay. This is your pulmonary valve here. This is a semilunar valve, and it just has areas you can see divided, a little different type of valve. Okay. This is the aortic valve when it's closed. You can see each of the 3 areas here that are sealed. So blood is not going to pump into the aorta until that valve opens. Okay. So valves function during the cardiac cycle. The papillary muscles relax due to the pressure in the atrium. So the AV valve opens. Okay. When the ventricles contract, the pressure causes semilunar valves to open. With that pressure, the semilunar valve and the blood squirts out. Also upon contraction, the blood forces the AV valve to close. So the blood going through the semilunar valve doesn't back up and go back up into the atrium. So when the ventricle contracts, the AV valve closes, aortic valve opens. So when it contracts, the blood can only go into the aorta from the left ventricle. The right ventricle, when it contracts, its AV valve closes and it goes in the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary valve opens. So the blood only goes one direction because the AV valve closed, the semilunar valves open. So when it contracts, it goes that direction to the lungs or to the body. Right? Again, that's the same picture we just showed. Here's the AV valve closed, the aortic valve closed. So when the blood flows from the left atrium into the left ventricle, the AV valve slams shut and the aortic valve opens. So it gets blocked here and only has this way to go. It forces blood to pump in the right direction. And this is a picture of an open aortic valve. And you see the difference. Once that opens up, blood can then flow into the aorta or the pulmonary trunk. Like I said, there's 2 semilunar valves. All right, so now we have coronary blood vessels of the heart. The heart has to have an extensive blood supply. Okay, to keep it beating. It's a lot of muscles, has to beat a lot. So the coronary blood supply originates at the base of the ascending aorta. supplies the cardiac muscle tissues. Okay. You have selected coronary vessels. You have the right coronary artery and the left coronary artery. Okay. Your right coronary artery branches into the right marginal branch and to the posterior interventricular branch. The left coronary artery branches into the circumflex branch, the left marginal branch, and the anterior interventricular branch. Those are the blood supplies as they branch into different arteries to supply oxygen to the heart. Okay. The right coronary artery passes between the right auricle, the atrium, and the pulmonary trunk. The major branches of this right coronary artery is the atrial branches, the right marginal branch, the posterior interventricular branch, and the conducting system branches. Okay, I'm going to show you what these are. Looking at the heart, this is the right coronary artery. As it feeds down, let me get a different color. See what shows up best. Purple. Nah, it doesn't show good. How about white? White will probably show good. Yeah, that's your right coronary artery. Okay, and it branches into, you have atrial branches, which branch here and here, supplying the right atrium. Okay, you got marginal branches that branch off and come down and support and supply the ventral. Like white isn't that good of a color. Let's try blue. Okay, on the left side, you have the left coronary artery. Okay, you see where it comes across here. You get the circumflex branch of the left coronary artery comes off. This is one division here. Here's your left coronary artery, branches off, and to the left in the circumflex branch, left coronary artery, and the anterior interventricular branch of the left coronary artery as it branches down. Okay. Again, the heart has an extensive blood flow, and you have to get the blood flow to it. Okay. So the left coronary artery, like we just saw in the last picture, branches into the circumflex branch and the anterior interventricular branch. Circumflex branch branches to from the left marginal branch, which goes along the ventricle and then to the apex of the heart. And the circumflex also branches from the posterior left ventricular branch to branch the superior portion of the ventricle. The anterior interventricular branch leads to the posterior interventricular branch, and that's called anastomosis. Anastomosis is a network where these veins branch out into like a tree-like structure. That's an anastomosis. Okay. So again, we have the left coronary artery, which it comes right from this direction, right here. Okay, you get the circumflex branch, you get the anterior interventricular branch. You can see the marginal branches innervating the ventricle, and the atrial branches innervating the atrium. Okay. Looking at the back of the heart, this is the reverse side of it. You can see the atrial branch of the left carotid artery and the circumflex branch of the left common artery. Okay. That branches into the marginal branch there and the posterior left ventricular branch coming off the left carotid artery. Okay. And here, this is a good picture. We haven't seen much of this, of the coronary sinus. This is one of your veins returning, and this is the other vein that returns blood into the right atrium of the heart. Remember the superior vena cava and inferior vena cava, and then the coronary sinus brings, all three of those bring blood back into the heart. And the coronary sinus you can't usually see because it always comes from the back of the heart. So it innervates into the rear of the right atrium. That's just a good picture of it. Coronary veins, we get the blood to the heart. Now the blood's got to come back into the heart for oxygenation. Okay. It drains cardiac venous blood and ends up in the right atrium. Okay. So all the blood from the body, when it's used up, except for the lungs, comes back into the right atrium through the superior vena cava, through the inferior vena cava, and through the carotid sinus, the coronary sinus, coronary sinus. Okay, so all they drain venous blood into the right atrium where it all comes back into. And you got the great cardiac vein, which delivers blood to your coronary sinus, goes back into the right atrium. You got your middle cardiac vein, delivers blood back to the coronary sinus. And the coronary sinus drains directly into the posterior aspect of the right atrium. So remember, there's three veins that drain into the right atrium directly. Superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus. The coronary sinus you usually don't see because it comes into the back of the heart, into the back of the right atrium. Okay, you also have the posterior vein of the left ventricle, okay, which parallels the posterior left ventricular branch, just like the artery, they run together. You have a small cardiac vein, which parallels your right coronary artery, and you have an anterior cardiac vein, which branches from the right ventricle cardiac cells. Okay. So here's your great cardiac vein. You can see where it's draining. It's coming, blood's coming up through here. And it's going to eventually going into the carotid sinus. Okay. You have your small cardiac vein, and you have your anterior cardiac veins. Okay. And they're all going to drain into the coronary sinus and into the right atrium. On the back side of the heart, again, here's your coronary sinus. That's what you're going to drain into, all these veins. You have a small cardiac vein, and you have the middle cardiac vein. You can see how they drain up into the coronary sinus. Then you have your great cardiac vein, come between the left atrium and the left ventricle, and your posterior vein of the left ventricle. Again, all those drain into the coronary sinus, into the right atrium. So the cardiac cycle consists of alternate periods of contraction and relaxation. The heart has to contract to force the blood out. It has to relax so the heart can fill. Okay. When the heart contracts, it's called systole. When the heart relaxes, it's called diastole. That's what you measure with blood pressure. You're measuring the systolic force and the diastolic. The systolic is your contraction, the diastolic is your resting volume. If you've got a blood pressure of 120/80, okay, on your patient, the 120 is your systolic pressure. That's systole, that's your force of contraction. Your diastole is your 80, that's the force of your heart at rest. Okay, during contraction, blood is ejected into the ventricles from the atriums. Blood is ejected into the pulmonary trunk and the ascending aorta. So when the heart contracts, it flows from the atrium into the ventricles on the right and left sides. It flows from the ventricles, the right ventricle into the pulmonary trunk, the left ventricle into the aorta. Okay. During rest, during diastole, these chambers are filling with blood. Okay. When you're dealing with a patient with hypertension, this number becomes really important. Your resting blood pressure. You want that number to be as low as possible. We can bring the other number down, but that number is the diastolic pressure is what you want your heart. You want your heart to recover. You don't want the number to go very high. They changed it. They want around 70 now rather than 80. So cardiac contractions are coordinated by conducting cells. Remember, we said we don't need central nervous system input for the heart to contract. The heart contracts on its own. And it contracts, there's two conducting cells in the heart. There's nodal cells and there's conducting fibers. Okay? The nodal cells are your sinoatrial nodes and your atrioventricular nodes. That allows the electrical signal to coordinate and allow the heart to contract as a unit. Okay? I mean, it would do no good if these muscles contract at different times, then the blood wouldn't flow. Okay? That's what a heart attack is. A heart attack is ventricular fibrillation. That's when the ventricles, they contract all the time. They contract and they shiver. Okay, so ventricular fibrillation was the ventricles sit there and they contract so fast that the atrium can't fill them. So no blood's being passed. No pass through into the aorta. No blood's going through and washing with the body. Heart attack. Okay, that's a ventricular fibrillation. Now you can have atrial fibrillation, which is not as dangerous. Okay, they can fibrillate and blood can still get through into the ventricles. But ventricular fibrillation is where it gets very dangerous for a patient. So the sinoatrial node and the AV nodes, the atrioventricular nodes, those establish the rate of your contraction. These are your pacemakers of your heart. They determine how often the heart is going to contract, the rate of it. And these cell membranes automatically depolarize. They do not need impulse or signals from the central nervous system to depolarize and cause a contraction. Then the conducting fibers distribute that contractile stimulus to the myocardium, which are the heart muscles, and that causes contraction. But your SA node and your AV node are your pacemakers of your heart. They determine your contraction rate. Okay. The SA node, the sinoatrial node, sits on the floor of the right atrium. Okay. So your SA node sits on the floor of the right atrium, and your AV node sits on the floor of your right atrium. So it's easy to remember where those nodes are. They're in the right atrium. The SA node is located in the posterior wall, and it's also called your cardiac pacemaker. And it generates between 80 to 100 axial potentials every minute. Right? So as it stimulates those axial potentials, your heart beats 80 to 100 times per minute. When you expose the heart to acetylcholine is your parasympathetic response. Parasympathetic is your kick back, relax, your big turkey dinner. Okay, that's your parasympathetic response. So the axial potentials slow down. When your axial potentials slow down, become less frequent, that's called bradycardia. Your heart rate drops. Okay. On exposure to norepinephrine, norepinephrine is your sympathetic response, made by the cortex of the adrenal glands. Okay. This axial potential speed up. That's called tachycardia. That's where your heart rate becomes faster. So when the SA node is exposed to acetylcholine, that's your parasympathetic nerves, it slows down, bradycardia. When the SA node is exposed to norepinephrine, okay, that's your sympathetic, that's your fight or flight response. That's getting your body ready. Okay, the axial potential speed up, tachycardia. Okay, so what happens is the impulse travels from the SA node to the AV node. So it all starts at the sinoatrial node, your pacemaker, and that goes to the AV node. The atriums contract, forcing blood into the ventricles. Now the impulse travels to the AV node and then to the AV bundle. The AV bundle goes along the interventricular septum, the muscle right between the ventricles, and divides to right and left bundle branches. And they sell into what's called Purkinje fibers. Those are not the same thing as the Purkinje cells we had in the cerebellum. Purkinje cells are those multi-dendrite things that branched out for the cerebellum to incorporate its actions onto our actions. Allow muscles to move smoothly and stuff like that. Those are your Purkinje cells. These are Purkinje fibers, they're different. Okay. The Purkinje fibers then allow the ventricle to contract. Okay. That's the pathway. Okay, so here's the components of it as we just talked about. This is your SA node, your AV node after interval pathway, goes to the AV bundle, goes to the left branch, goes to the right branch, goes through the moderator band, which is that muscle contraction right in here on the right ventricle, and to the Purkinje fibers. And Purkinje fibers cause a contraction of the ventricles. Okay, so here's your electrical impulses. That's how long it takes. It goes from the SA node to the AV node, to the AV bundle, to the bundle branches, through the moderator band, into the Purkinje fibers, into the contraction of the ventricles. That's how the electrical impulse travels through the heart. And again, the SA node is what starts it. That's your pacemaker, cardiac pacemaker. That's what determines your rate. That's what's affected by acetylcholine. That's what's affected by norepinephrine, is the SA node. And that controls the rate of contractions of your heart. And the cardiac cycle, just as we talked about, you have the atrial systole begin, contraction of the atriums. Atrial systole ends, and the atrial diastole begins. It's time to relax, and blood fills it. Okay, then you get your ventricle systole, your ventricle second phase as the ventricles start to contract, pump blood out. Then you get the ventricles relaxing, and the ventricles fill, and then it starts to cycle over again. Atriums start to contract, and so on. It just forces blood from the atriums to the ventricles, to the rest of the body, back to the atriums. All right, so the pacemaker sets the heart rate, and you can alter it. Impulsively autonomic nervous system, modify the pacemaker, like we said. Acetylcholine from the parasympathetic nervous system causes bradycardia. Okay. Norepinephrine from the sympathetic nervous system causes tachycardia. So these nerves from the autonomic nervous system, whether parasympathetic or sympathetic, innervate the SA node, the AV node, the cardiac cells, and smooth muscles in the cardiac blood vessels, and allow effects of all those effects of their hormone. So the effects of norepinephrine, acetylcholine we just talked about. Norepinephrine, okay, increase in heart rate, that's tachycardia. Okay, it increases the heart rate and increases the force of contractions. That's your fight or flight response. Acetylcholine, that causes bradycardia. Okay, there's a decrease in the heart rate and a decrease in the force of contractions. It allows you to relax, kick back, enjoy your turkey dinner coming up. You have control of it. It's through different cardiac centers in the medulla oblongata, which modify the heart rate. This stimulates activity of the sympathetic neurons. You have your cardioacceleratory center is activated, heart rate increases. If the cardioinhibitory center is activated, the heart rate decreases. This is involved with cranial nerve number 10. This is the vagus nerve. This is the one that the police use in chokeholds to shut the heart down, and that causes you to pass out. Okay, the vagus nerve, when it's inhibited, causes the heart rate to decrease, and the person will pass out. That's the nerve we do with the John Benet Ramsey case. That's probably the nerve that caused her death when they tried to spin, they strangled her, and it was by accident. But this is your cardioinhibitory center and your cardioexcitatory center. And you can see where it runs into the cranial nerve number 10 for the inhibitory center. And again, the 10th cranial nerve is compressed or damaged. It causes the heart to slow down. Okay, and you have a sympathetic response, which causes tachycardia and a forceful contraction. You have a parasympathetic response, okay, which causes bradycardia and less forceful contraction. The sympathetic neurotransmitter is norepinephrine. The parasympathetic is acetylcholine. That's an H, sort of an H. Okay. All right, let's see who's paying attention. Then we'll call it quits here. We should be almost done with this chapter anyways, I think. All right, number 1. What is that? What's that structure?
Right ventricle.
Right ventricle. Number 2.
Left ventricle.
Left ventricle. Number 3.
Right atrium.
Right atrium. There's no number 4. Start. Okay, this artery coming off the aorta right here. This is what?
Carotid.
Left common carotid artery. And the next one is the.
Which way are we going?
This way. This one right here.
Left subclavian.
That's the Clavian artery. Oh, no. I went the other way. I usually go to the right. Okay, we're going the other way. Back up a little bit. Okay. Right ventricle, left ventricle, right atrium, and left concrete. So we're going this way around our. So this is a brachiocephalic trunk coming out here. The brachiocephalic trunk, the left common carotid artery, and the left subclavian artery. Okay, and this is what? This one's pointing to what?
Ascending aorta.
Ascending aorta. Perfect. Okay, and this one's pointing to what's this right here?
Superior vena cava.
Your vena cava. What are the 3 ways blood gets into the right atrium? The superior vena cava. What else?
Inferior vena cava.
Perfect. Inferior vena cava and the. What brings blood back from the heart itself? Coronary sinus. Coronary sinus brings it back in behind the heart. Okay. And this is
The right atrium.
This is the right atrium. It's the auricle, the flapping over the right atrium. And this is what? This is fat But it's in what? Where's the fat line? What's this groove called where the fat's lying in?
Coronary sulcus.
Yep, it's the fat in the coronary sulcus. It divides the atrium and the ventricle. Okay, and then this, I assume we're going to this one here. This divides the two ventricles. So what is that one?
Intraventricular.
Interventricular sulcus. And then just fat pads. The fat pads help protect the heart and provide energy if needed. And then this is the this
Left
is-
atrium.
perfect. It's the aorta over the left atrium. Yep. It's just the pad over the left atrium. Perfect. And then this guy here, this is, what is that?
Pulmonary trunk.
Pulmonary trunk. That's where from the right ventricle pushes blood out through the pulmonary trunk through the pulmonary valve. Okay. And then coming up here, this pulmonary trunk branches into what?
The left.
Okay. The left and right pulmonary arteries. But this one's the left pulmonary artery. You're right. And then this is what part of the aorta right here?
Descending.
Descending aorta, right? Okay. And there's a little flap of tissue right here. We didn't talk about that. So that's the ligament arteriosum that holds it because the aorta has so much force. This holds the aorta down with that blood's being pumped through it. So it doesn't just distort itself all over the place. Okay. And this is the what?
Aortic arch.
The aortic arch. And this little artery right here is the left
Subclavian.
subclavian artery.